Greetings and salutations. This video is part 3 of 3 in my Why Autistic Men Love Gaming series. If you haven't already seen the first 2 parts, I would strongly recommend you go back and watch those first to gain a more thorough understanding of the concepts I'm about to discuss. However, I have intentionally structured these videos to deepen your knowledge individually, even if they are watched out of sequence. Today's lesson is, as above, so below, how principles you learn in video games can benefit you in real life. As per the previous videos, I will break the subjects down in terms of immersion, dopamine, accomplishment, competition, community, and failure, explaining each one in depth.
Immersion.
Let's begin with immersion. In my younger years, I delved very deeply into various topics related to metaphysical thought, and one of the more interesting things I discovered was a principle called thought forms. This concept more or less supposes that there are invisible structures constructed out of persistent human thoughts that correspond to various ideas. The idea is that tapping into these fields of thought can vastly accelerate learning and understanding of a particular thing. For example, let's imagine a person is interested in learning a new language. While there are many valid approaches to such a task, most polyglots will tell you that the best way to do so is finding a way to fully immerse yourself in the culture of the language you are trying to learn. This may mean making friends that already speak the language, traveling to the country where the language is spoken, and even training yourself to start thinking in the language. What you don't necessarily realize is that you are actually tapping into the pre-existing fields of thought that are related to that language. The deeper you go, the more you will absorb the essence of it until it is fully integrated. Furthermore, this is something you can consciously do, and should do, especially when you're trying to master something you are unfamiliar with. The point is, if you can grind for a rare item with an absurdly low drop rate, you can apply that same dedication to acquiring things that benefit you in real life. It's all about mindset.
Dopamine.
Next, dopamine. As I said in part 2, part of the reason gaming can be so addictive is because the developers understand how to link your brain's dopamine centers to action reward cycles within their games. However, it's entirely possible to create those kinds of cycles for yourself when it comes to repetitive processes that will benefit you in real life. To do so, let us look at the classic example of Pavlov's dogs. For those unfamiliar with the story, Pavlov was a scientist that trained his dogs by ringing a bell every time he was going to feed them. Eventually, the dogs began associating the bell with food, and would begin to salivate each time the bell was rung, even if there was no food. This concept would later be known as conditioned response, and it is relevant because the human mind can be trained in the same way. For instance, if there's something you hate doing that you know benefits you, start rewarding yourself immediately after you do it, each time. Eventually your mind will form the association between the action and the reward, which will lead you to forming a habit. We already do this with things that feel good, which is why most of us have plenty of bad habits. But in this case, we are using it to our advantage.
Accomplishment.
Now, we move on to accomplishment. One of the major takeaways we can get from being serious gamers is the understanding that sometimes, the most efficient way to succeed is following in the footsteps of someone who has already achieved the things that we wish to ourselves. It goes without saying that figuring out an effective strategy on your own can be a very rewarding feeling, but we all eventually hit a wall, or plateau in terms of our forward progress in life, whether in a general sense, or when it comes to a specific goal we want to accomplish. At these points, it is important to remember that there are real-life walkthroughs available. These can be in the form of video learning, such as you might find on a channel like this, consulting with trustworthy friends or family members, or in cases where the information you're looking for is very specific, seeking out professional assistance. Power leveling with a trainer will almost always take you further, faster, than attempting to do something on your own that you aren't familiar with, so being open to a mentor of some kind can often be the boost you need to take you to the next level. I also feel like it is relevant to this section to briefly talk about the concept of shortcuts. Essentially, what I have noticed is that taking shortcuts, both in video games and in life, will almost always end up screwing you over later on. Why? Well, First and foremost, the idea that you can skip steps and suffer no consequences is inherently faulty. You need to learn the basics of a given thing, as they serve as your foundation for the future. Sure, you can run past the enemies in an area where you're underleveled in order to grab some equipment that will give you an advantage, but do you even have the stat requirements to equip it without severe penalties? It's similar to lying on your job application. You might get the job, but if you end up not having the ability to do it because your foundation is lacking, it's entirely possible you'll end up worse off than never having gotten it at all. Obviously, some people can finesse these things, but the exception does not define the rule. Just do the work, and even if you struggle, the basics you have mastered will serve as a foundation you can use to build yourself further.
Community.
Continuing onwards, we arrive at community. Are you a player that prefers to play solo? I am. With little exception, I don't enjoy having followers or companions, unless it's required for the content I'm tackling. I like to operate like a ninja, stealthily completing whatever objectives are necessary, and companions have always been counter to that, in my observation. I also notice that having meat shields tends to make you lax, and ultimately dulls your blade in terms of the skills you develop when you can only rely on yourself. And in a certain sense, this mindset also applies to me in real life. However, while this attitude can work in video games, experience has shown me that establishing and maintaining community in real life is something that should never be underestimated in terms of importance. In order to function and thrive, it is absolutely essential that you find your tribe, people that have your best interests in mind, and are willing to provide you with assistance and resources, whether it's emotional, physical, financial, or even spiritual. Playing solo simply doesn't work, because unlike the video game world, you have neither an infinite amount of tries, nor the time and resources to learn critical lessons through failing 1,000 times. The consequences can be dire for trying to do so. So figure out your strengths and weaknesses, hone in on your interests that can be of service to others, and find your guild. It's the best way to play.
Failure.
Finally, we come to failure. One of the most valuable lessons we can take from video games is that we shouldn't fear failure in general, but rather, we should strive to fail in the right way. And what I mean by that is perfectly demonstrated in the context of games like the Dark Souls series. If you aren't familiar with the concept of Souls-like games, they are known for being much more difficult than your average games. However, if you are willing to put in the time and energy, you can always overcome the trials they throw at you by systematically making corrections to your approach. And this is what I mean by failing in the right way. If you want to accomplish anything significant in life, you must be willing to take the first step, and sometimes that first step may be into a pothole. However, there is a correct path to whatever you want to accomplish, and you will almost always find it, if it is within the domain of your purpose to do so. The thing about failing is that you gain information and experience that can be applied to your future attempts. Ultimately, if you make a conscious effort to never fail the same way twice, and adapt your approach, you will eventually get where you are trying to go, especially if you thoroughly research what you are doing beforehand, and take into account the guidance and experiences of people who have already gone where you want to go. But don't get stuck in the research phase, as this can often be a self-sabotage mechanism that prevents you from ever starting at all. However, maybe that goes without saying if you've already been there. And there you have it. It took a while to get here, but we have arrived at the end of this video series. I hope you enjoyed this content, and more importantly, I hope it provided value to you, even if that was simply a different perspective than you're accustomed to. Let me know in the comments what other topics you'd like to see videos on. Anyways, like, subscribe, send a brother $5 on Cash App. Until the next time, keep it cool.